Alexander Hamilton, from Caribbean storms to American shores. The hurricane announced itself with a whisper. On the morning of August 31st, 1772, the air over St. Croix hung thick and still, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain. 17-year-old Alexander Hamilton stood in the doorway of Beekman and Kruger's counting house, watching as an unnatural darkness crept across the Caribbean sky. The young clerk had witnessed storms before, but something about this day felt different. The walls of the building seemed to breathe with the dropping pressure, and in the harbor, seasoned captains were already ordering their ships to double their moorings. By nightfall, the whisper had become a scream. The hurricane struck with biblical fury, shredding wooden buildings into splinters and hurling ships onto the shore like children's toys. Hamilton, safe in one of the island's few stone buildings, bore witness to nature's awesome display of power. But even as the storm raged, something extraordinary was happening inside the young man's mind. While others cowered, Hamilton began to write, his quill flying across the page with an urgency that would become his trademark. The letter he composed that night, describing the hurricane in vivid, haunting prose, would prove to be his ticket off the island, though he couldn't have known it then. But to understand how Hamilton came to be in that counting house, and how a hurricane would launch his remarkable journey to the American mainland, we must step back into the shadows of his childhood, a tale that reads more like a Greek tragedy than the origin story of a founding father. The precise year of Hamilton's birth remains contested. He himself was uncertain whether it was 1755 or 1757. What is certain is that he entered the world on the small island of Nevis, born to Rachel Faucett, a woman of French Huguenot descent, and James Hamilton, a Scottish trader of noble blood but empty pockets. The circumstances of his birth would haunt him throughout his life. His mother had fled a previous marriage, making Alexander technically illegitimate in the eyes of colonial society. Rachel Faucett emerges from historical records as a woman of remarkable resilience and intelligence. Despite the social stigma she faced, she managed to establish a small shop on St. Croix, where the family moved when Alexander was young. In the evenings, she would read to her sons by candlelight, French fairy tales and stories from classical antiquity that would later pepper Hamilton's writings. From her, Alexander inherited not only his quick intelligence, but also his driving ambition and determination to rise above his circumstances. James Hamilton, however, was a study in failure. Though charming and well-educated, he proved chronically unable to succeed in business. By 1766, when Alexander was around 11, James abandoned the family entirely, leaving Rachel to raise two young boys alone in a society that showed little mercy to single mothers. Then came the fever. In February 1768, both Rachel and Alexander fell ill with a violent tropical disease. For days, mother and son lay in adjacent beds, burning with fever. Alexander recovered. Rachel did not. She died on February 19th, leaving her sons effectively orphaned. In her will, she tried to leave her few possessions to her innocent children. But colonial law, citing her illegitimate status, gave everything to her first husband's family instead. The next few years saw young Alexander bounced between relatives and sympathetic friends. His cousin and guardian, Peter Lytton, committed suicide. His aunt, uncle, and grandmother all died in quick succession. Yet somehow, amid this cascade of tragedies, Hamilton's brilliant mind continued to develop. Working as a clerk for the international trading firm of Beekman and Kruger, he learned the intricacies of global commerce, currencies, and credit knowledge that would later prove crucial to building a nation's financial system. By day, he managed the firm's books, wrote correspondence in multiple languages, and even ran the entire operation when the owner was away at sea. By night, he devoured books on every subject he could find, teaching himself economics, literature and philosophy. The other clerks called him the young West Indian, but the local merchants quickly learned to respect the precocious youth who could calculate complex sums in his head and quote Plutarch from memory. Then came that fateful hurricane in August 1772. Hamilton's letter describing the catastrophe, published in the Royal Danish American Gazette, revealed not just his literary talent, but his ability to find meaning in chaos. The account so impressed local businessmen that they took up a collection to send the young genius to North America for a proper education. And so, with little more than his talent and ambition to recommend him, Alexander Hamilton prepared to leave the Caribbean behind. He had survived abandonment, illegitimacy, yellow fever, poverty, and a hurricane. He had worked himself nearly to exhaustion, studied through the night, and never stopped dreaming of something greater. Now, at last, his chance had come. As he boarded the ship bound for Boston in October 1772, Hamilton carried with him something more valuable than money or social position. He possessed an absolute conviction that the power of the human mind, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. The hurricane had taught him that life could change in an instant, that fortune's wheel was always turning. But it had also shown him that even in the midst of chaos, one could find opportunity, if one was bold enough to seize it. The orphan boy from Nevis was about to step onto a much larger stage. He would never return to the Caribbean, but he would carry its lessons with him always. That life was fragile, that time was precious, and that a man armed with intelligence, ambition, and an iron will could rise above any circumstances to reshape his destiny. And reshape it he would. A mind on fire, Alexander Hamilton's revolutionary beginnings. The New York that greeted Alexander Hamilton in October 1772 was a city poised for revolution, though few yet recognized it. As the young West Indian made his way up the cobblestone streets of Lower Manhattan, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and sea salt, he passed coffee houses where merchants argued about the Tea Act and taverns where sailors sang ribald songs about King George. Hamilton absorbed it all with the keen eye of an outsider who intended to become an insider. He had arrived with letters of introduction from merchants in St. Croix, but more importantly, he carried with him an almost supernatural ability to impress anyone who spent more than 5 minutes in his company. Within weeks, he had charmed his way into the heart of New York's educational establishment. After a brief preparatory period with William Colden at a grammar school in New Jersey, where he characteristically completed several years' worth of study in less than a year, Hamilton set his sights on King's College, now Columbia University. The college interview nearly derailed before it began. "I wish to pursue the most rapid course of study possible," Hamilton informed the college's president, Miles Cooper, a staunch Tory who would later flee America in fear of his life. Cooper, taken aback by the young man's presumption, began to explain the standard curriculum. Hamilton interrupted him, a characteristic that would both help and hinder him throughout his life, and proceeded to outline his own proposed course of study. By the end of the interview, Cooper had granted Hamilton permission to proceed at his own pace. And what a pace it was. Hamilton approached his studies with the same ferocious intensity he had shown in the Caribbean counting house. He devoured Cicero and Newton, mastered calculus, and still found time to join a debating society where he honed the argumentative skills that would later make him one of America's most formidable lawyers. His friend Robert Troup later recalled finding Hamilton in his room at all hours, sprawled amid piles of books, scribbling notes by candlelight until the dawn crept through his window. But Hamilton's education wasn't confined to the classroom. New York in the 1770s was a crucible of revolutionary thought, and the young student found himself drawn into increasingly heated political debates. At first, like many recent arrivals from the Caribbean, he sided with the Crown. His experience with mob violence in the West Indies had left him deeply suspicious of popular uprisings. Yet as he studied political philosophy and observed British policy firsthand, his views began to shift. The turning point came in 1774, when Hamilton attended a massive public meeting in the Fields, now City Hall Park. The crowd had gathered to debate New York's response to the Coercive Acts, Parliament's punitive legislation against Boston. As speaker after speaker rose to address the crowd, Hamilton found himself increasingly restless. The arguments seemed tepid, the logic flawed. Finally, unable to contain himself, he pushed through the crowd and climbed onto the makeshift platform. What happened next became legend. For the next hour, the teenage Hamilton held thousands spellbound with an impromptu speech that wove together constitutional theory, economic analysis, and moral philosophy. He spoke without notes, drawing on everything from British common law to his first-hand experience with imperial trade policy in the Caribbean. The crowd, which had begun the day largely sympathetic to moderate compromise, ended it calling for resistance. The sacred rights of mankind, Hamilton would later write in his first published political pamphlet, are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. The pamphlet, published anonymously in 1774 under the title A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress, sparked a literary sensation. When his authorship was revealed, many refused to believe that such a sophisticated analysis could have come from a 19-year-old college student. But Hamilton was just getting started. Over the next 2 years, he would produce a series of increasingly influential writings that helped shape the intellectual foundations of the American Revolution. Yet even as he threw himself into the revolutionary cause, Hamilton maintained his characteristic complexity. Unlike many patriots who simply demonized Britain, he understood the sophisticated systems of law, commerce, and governance that had made the British Empire great. His goal was not to destroy these systems, but to improve upon them, a nuanced position that would later influence his vision for America's future. As tensions escalated, Hamilton began preparing for the inevitable conflict. He joined a volunteer militia company called the Hearts of Oak, drilling before dawn in the college courtyard. He studied military science with the same intensity he had applied to his academic subjects, paying particular attention to artillery tactics. When his friend Robert Troup questioned this martial turn, Hamilton replied with characteristic certainty, "A war is coming, and I mean to be ready for it." By early 1776, the transformation was complete. The young man who had arrived in New York as a loyal subject of the crown had become one of the Revolution's most eloquent advocates. Yet Hamilton's revolutionary fervor was always tempered by his deep understanding of the need for order and system. Even as he called for independence, he was already thinking about what would come after, about how to build something lasting from the ashes of empire. In March of that year, as British warships gathered in New York Harbor, Hamilton made a decision that would alter the course of his life, and ultimately, the course of American history. He withdrew from King's College and accepted command of an artillery company. The scholar was about to become a soldier, but he would never cease being a student of power, systems, and the art of turning chaos into order. The next time Hamilton addressed a crowd in New York, it would not be from a makeshift platform, but from behind a cannon, and his words would be punctuated not by applause, but by the thunder of artillery fire. The revolution he had championed with his pen was about to be tested by powder and shot, and Alexander Hamilton was ready to prove himself on yet another stage. The mind on fire was about to light a nation's fuse. The soldier's path, Alexander Hamilton's military journey. The first thing Captain Alexander Hamilton noticed about his new artillery company was that half the men couldn't read. The second was that their cannons were in worse shape than the men. It was March 1776, and the 21-year-old commander had inherited a ragtag collection of merchants, laborers, and craftsmen who shared his revolutionary fervor, but little of his military knowledge. Most young officers would have despaired. Hamilton got to work. Drawing on the organizational skills he'd honed in the Caribbean counting house, he transformed his company into one of the Continental Army's most efficient units. He spent his own money on uniforms and equipment. He taught his literate men to keep precise records of ammunition and supplies. He drilled his gunners relentlessly, teaching them to load and fire their pieces with a speed that would soon become legendary. And somehow, between drills and administrative duties, he found time to master the complex mathematics of artillery trajectories. On July 12, 1776, Hamilton's preparation met its first test. British warships began sailing up the East River, their gun ports open, their decks cleared for action. Hamilton's battery, positioned at the foot of Broadway, opened fire. His careful calculations proved deadly accurate. Several British ships were struck, forcing the fleet to reconsider its approach. It was a small victory, but it caught the attention of several senior officers, including Nathaniel Greene, who made a note to remember the young artillery captain's name. But the triumph was short-lived. In August, the British returned in force. 25,000 professional soldiers, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas, descended on New York. What followed was a military disaster for the Americans, saved from becoming a complete catastrophe only by the efforts of units like Hamilton's artillery, which covered the retreat of Washington's army. Through the long months of defeat and withdrawal that followed, Hamilton distinguished himself not just through courage, but through composure. While other units fell apart during the retreat through New Jersey, his company maintained its discipline and, crucially, its guns. At Trenton, on December 26, 1776, Hamilton's artillery played a crucial role in Washington's surprise victory over the Hessians, his guns firing through driving snow to prevent the enemy's escape. It was during this period that Hamilton first caught George Washington's eye. The commander-in-chief had watched the young captain handle his guns with precision during several engagements. More importantly, he had seen the detailed reports Hamilton submitted, models of clarity and analysis that stood out amid the often chaotic paperwork of the Continental Army. On March 1, 1777, Washington offered Hamilton a position on his staff with the rank of lieutenant colonel. It was an extraordinary opportunity for a man of Hamilton's age and background. It was also, in Hamilton's mind, a mixed blessing. He accepted with one condition: that he be allowed to return to field command when the opportunity for glory presented itself. Hamilton's new role as aide-de-camp thrust him into the inner circle of the Revolution's military leadership. His duties were endless: drafting orders, corresponding with Congress, negotiating with allies, and often serving as Washington's confidential secretary. He worked 18-hour days, his quill scratching through the night as he composed the commander's voluminous correspondence. One visitor to headquarters noted that Hamilton seemed to write as if there were 10 pens in his hand. The relationship between Washington and Hamilton grew complex and deep. The childless general and the fatherless aide formed a bond that transcended their military roles. Washington came to rely not just on Hamilton's pen, but on his judgment. Hamilton found in Washington something he'd never had: a mentor who combined unimpeachable integrity with practical wisdom. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface. Hamilton chafed at what he sometimes saw as glorified secretarial work. He longed for field command, for the chance to prove himself in battle. Washington, protective of his talented aide and aware of his value to headquarters, repeatedly denied his requests to return to combat. The friction finally erupted on February 16, 1781. Hamilton, arriving late for a meeting, encountered Washington on the stairs. The general's rebuke, "Colonel Hamilton, you have kept me waiting," met with an explosive response. "I am not a clerk, sir. Hamilton replied. "Your Excellency's letters to Congress I wrote from duty, but I was not obliged to be your copyist." The two men parted in anger. Hamilton resigned his position the same day. Yet even this breach proved temporary. Washington, recognizing Hamilton's worth, soon recommended him for a field command. At Yorktown, Hamilton finally got his chance for glory, leading a nighttime assault on British Redoubt No. 10 on October 14, 1781. His men took the position in 10 minutes, using only bayonets, a feat that helped seal Cornwallis's surrender and effectively end the war. The victory at Yorktown marked the end of Hamilton's military career, but the lessons he learned as a soldier and staff officer would shape his later life. He had seen firsthand the problems of a weak central government unable to properly supply its army. He had witnessed the power of disciplined organization to transform raw recruits into effective fighters. Most importantly, he had forged relationships with men like Washington, Lafayette, and Knox connections that would prove crucial in the political battles to come. As Hamilton rode north from Yorktown, his military service behind him, he carried with him more than memories of battle. He had learned the art of command, the importance of administrative efficiency, and the delicate balance between action and planning. He had also learned something about himself, that his ambitions would always struggle against his sense of duty, and that his fierce independence would forever war with his need for mentorship and validation. The soldier was about to become a statesman, but he would always approach politics with a general's eye for strategy and a soldier's understanding that victory requires both boldness and discipline. The battlefield had taught him lessons that would soon help him wage a different kind of war. One fought not with cannons and bayonets, but with bonds, banks, and the power of a properly organized government. Love and Ambition, the story of Alexander Hamilton and Eliza Schuyler. In the winter of 1780, Alexander Hamilton had a problem that all his legendary intelligence couldn't solve. He was broke, in love, and had no idea how to reconcile these two conditions. The object of his affection was Eliza Schuyler, daughter of General Philip Schuyler, one of New York's most powerful men. Hamilton, still serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, had met her that February during a mission to Albany. By April, he was writing her letters that made even his usual prolific output seem modest. "I meet you in every dream," he wrote in one particularly passionate missive, "and when I wake, I cannot close my eyes again for ruminating on your sweetnesses." This from the same man who typically spent his evenings writing detailed analyses of military supply chains. Elizabeth, known as Eliza to her family, was unlike any woman Hamilton had previously courted. While he had flirted with the daughters of various patriots, including Eliza's own sister, Angelica, Eliza possessed a steadiness that balanced his mercurial nature. She was neither the wittiest nor the most beautiful of the Schuyler sisters, but she had a warmth and sincerity that pierced through Hamilton's carefully constructed defenses. The Schuyler family mansion in Albany where they courted was a far cry from Hamilton's humble origins. Its wide hallways and elegant furnishings represented everything he had ever wanted: stability, respectability, connection to the land. Philip Schuyler, watching the young aide-de-camp court his daughter, saw something of himself in Hamilton's ambition and intelligence. Despite Hamilton's lack of family connections or fortune, Schuyler recognized that this young man's star was rising. The wedding took place on December 14, 1780, at the Schuyler mansion. Hamilton wore his Continental Army uniform, his sword at his side. Eliza, radiant in a pearl-colored gown, brought more than love to the marriage. She brought connections to one of New York's most powerful families, access to capital that would prove crucial in Hamilton's early legal career, and most importantly, a steady emotional anchor for a man who had spent his life buffeted by fortune's winds. But even as Hamilton embraced domestic happiness, his ambition wouldn't let him rest. He returned to military duties with renewed energy, perhaps feeling that he now had even more to prove. His letters from this period show a man simultaneously planning military strategies and his future career, all while maintaining an impressive correspondence with his new wife. The end of the war in 1781 found Hamilton facing a crucial decision. He could have easily traded on his connections to secure a comfortable position in business or politics. Instead, he chose a more difficult path. Settling in Albany with Eliza, he began an intensive study of law, completing what typically took 3 years in a matter of months. These were lean times for the Hamiltons. Their first child, Philip, was born in 1782, adding expense to an already stretched budget. They lived in a small rented house, and Hamilton spent his days studying law while Eliza managed their modest household. Yet even in these early years, their partnership showed its strength. Eliza copied legal documents late into the night, helping her husband prepare for his bar examination. She learned to stretch $1 with the same skill her husband would later apply to the national debt. Hamilton's legal career began modestly but quickly gained momentum. His first cases were small matters, debt collections, minor property disputes, but he approached each one with the same intensity he had once applied to artillery calculations. His reputation grew, particularly in maritime law, where his experience in Caribbean trading proved invaluable. It was during these years that Hamilton began developing the financial expertise that would later shape the nation. Handling cases involving depreciated continental currency, state bonds, and maritime insurance gave him a practical education in economics that few other founding fathers could match. He saw firsthand how the weakness of the Confederation government was crippling commerce and creating legal chaos. The Hamiltons' social life expanded with Alexander's growing success. Their house became a gathering place for young lawyers, military veterans, and political thinkers. Eliza proved an adept hostess, creating the kind of salon atmosphere that Hamilton had admired during his military service in France. Her social skills complemented his intellectual fireworks, making them a formidable team in New York society. Yet these years were not without their shadows. Hamilton's close relationship with Eliza's sister Angelica, who had married and moved to London, sparked rumors that would persist for decades. His driven nature and tendency to work through the night strained his marriage at times, and his growing involvement in politics, particularly his advocacy for a stronger federal government, often took him away from home. The birth of their second child, Angelica, in 1784, coincided with Hamilton's emergence as a leading voice in New York politics. He was increasingly pulled between his growing family and his expanding public role. Eliza, showing the strength that would mark her entire life, managed both their domestic affairs and her husband's increasingly complicated social and political obligations. By the end of 1784, Hamilton had established himself as one of New York's leading lawyers and political thinkers. His marriage had given him the personal stability he had lacked all his life, while his legal practice had provided him with both financial security and practical insight into America's economic challenges. He was ready for a larger stage. In a letter to Eliza during this period, Hamilton wrote, "A complete tragedy would be my story if it wasn't for you." It was more than romantic hyperbole. In Eliza Schuyler, Hamilton had found not just a wife, but a partner who understood both his demons and his dreams. Their partnership would soon be tested by the greatest challenges of Hamilton's life, the creation of a new government and the battles over its future. The young law clerk who had married into one of New York's great families was about to help birth a nation. And at every step, whether triumph or controversy, Eliza would be there, keeping the accounts, copying the letters, raising their children, and providing the stable center that her brilliant, restless husband so desperately needed. Love and ambition had found their balance. Now it was time to change the world. Alexander Hamilton, architect of a nation's future. On a crisp autumn morning in 1784, Alexander Hamilton stood before the New York Supreme Court in Lower Manhattan, arguing a case that would come to symbolize the challenges facing the young nation. His client, a merchant named John Waddington, was being sued by a widow named Elizabeth Rutgers over a brewery seized during the British occupation. The case seemed simple on its surface, property rights after wartime confiscation. But Hamilton saw in it something much larger, a test of whether the new United States would honor international treaties and establish a predictable legal framework for commerce. A nation which can never be respected without character, Hamilton argued before the court, can never be prosperous without credit. The judges leaned forward, caught by the unusual spectacle of a lawyer arguing not just the facts of his case, but the future of American prosperity. Hamilton won the case, but the victory left him troubled. The Treaty of Paris, which had ended the Revolutionary War, was being ignored by state courts across the country. Each state printed its own money, regulated its own trade, and maintained its own foreign policy. It was, Hamilton realized, a recipe for chaos. This realization drove Hamilton to action on multiple fronts. In the spring of 1784, he gathered a group of New York's leading merchants in his Wall Street law office. The topic: establishing the Bank of New York, the city's first financial institution. Hamilton had studied the Bank of England's operations and was convinced that America needed similar institutions to facilitate trade and establish credit. The bank's founding documents, written in Hamilton's precise hand, revealed his genius for institutional design. He created a system of checks and balances within the bank structure that would later influence his design of the federal government. The bank would be private, but serve the public interest, independent but accountable themes that would recur throughout Hamilton's public career. Meanwhile, his law practice flourished, making him one of New York's most prominent attorneys. But increasingly, Hamilton's legal work focused on cases that highlighted the Confederation's weaknesses. He defended merchants against conflicting state regulations, argued cases involving depreciated currency, and dealt with the chaos of 13 states, each claiming sovereign powers. In 1786, the crisis he had foreseen began to materialize. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, an uprising of indebted farmers against the state government, sent shockwaves through the political establishment. While many dismissed it as a local problem, Hamilton saw it differently. In a series of private letters that circulated among the nation's leaders, he argued that the rebellion revealed the fundamental weakness of the Confederation government. "The present crisis is as critical as any this country has seen," he wrote to James Madison. "Yet we slumber while the abyss yawns before us." His language was characteristically dramatic, but events were proving him right. State currencies were collapsing, foreign nations were flouting trade agreements, and the Continental Congress couldn't even pay its own operating expenses. Hamilton began working with a network of like-minded leaders to call for a constitutional convention. His efforts found an unlikely ally in James Madison, a Virginia delegate whose political philosophy often differed from Hamilton's, but who shared his concern about the nation's direction. Together, they helped orchestrate a series of events that would lead to the Constitutional Convention. In the meantime, Hamilton threw himself into studying governmental systems. His library grew to include volumes on ancient republics, modern European governments, and economic theory. He corresponded with scholars and statesmen across Europe and America, building what amounted to a private research program in governmental design. His home became a kind of unofficial think tank. In the evenings, after court sessions or bank meetings, Hamilton would host dinner parties where conversation inevitably turned to questions of government and economics. Eliza, managing these gatherings with her usual grace, noticed that her husband seemed energized rather than exhausted by these discussions. He was, she realized, preparing for something bigger. The call for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia finally came in 1787. Hamilton had helped engineer this moment, but even he couldn't have predicted its historic significance. As he packed his papers and prepared to leave New York, Eliza handed him a packet of fresh quills. "You'll need these," she said, knowing her husband's writing habits. "You're going to help build something that will last." Hamilton kissed her goodbye and headed for Philadelphia. In his saddlebags, he carried not just legal briefs and economic treatises, but a vision of America that would challenge everything the Revolution had seemingly established. He wanted not just to fix the Articles of Confederation, but to create something entirely new. A powerful federal government capable of making America a commercial and military equal to European powers. It was an audacious goal for the foreign-born orphan who had arrived in America just 15 years earlier. But audacity had never been Hamilton's shortage. As his carriage rolled toward Philadelphia, he reviewed his notes one more time. The nation was about to undergo its second revolution, this one not of arms but of ideas, and Alexander Hamilton intended to be its architect. What he couldn't know was that the Constitutional Convention would test not just his ideas, but his patience, his political skills, and his very conception of what America could become. The lawyer who had argued for a predictable legal framework was about to enter the most unpredictable political battle of his life. The nation's architect was ready to build. Whether the other builders would accept his blueprints remained to be seen. The Federalist's pen, Hamilton's quest for ratification. The tavern was crowded that October evening in 1787, but the real heat came from the corner table where Alexander Hamilton sat, hunched over a stack of papers, writing as if his quill were on fire. The Constitutional Convention had ended, the document was signed, but Hamilton knew the real battle was just beginning. 9 states needed to ratify the Constitution for it to take effect, and New York, his home state and America's commercial hub, was leaning heavily against it. The rhetoric of the opposition must be met not with mere passion, but with reason, he had told James Madison a few days earlier. We need to explain this Constitution to the people, essay by essay, concept by concept. Now, surrounded by the noise of France's tavern, Hamilton was launching what would become one of the most remarkable literary and political projects in American history. The first essay appeared in the Independent Journal on October 27, 1787, under the pseudonym Publius. Hamilton had chosen the name carefully. Publius Valerius had helped found the Roman Republic, and Hamilton saw himself engaged in a similar enterprise. The essay began with characteristic urgency. After an unequivocal experience of the inefficiency of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. What followed would become known as the Federalist Papers, 85 essays defending and explaining the Constitution in unprecedented detail. Hamilton wrote 51 of them himself, with Madison contributing 29 and John Jay writing 5. The pace was punishing. Hamilton would often write through the night, sending pages to the printer while the ink was still wet. Sometimes he produced 4,000 words in a single sitting without significant revisions. The essays revealed Hamilton at his intellectual peak. Drawing on his vast reading in history, law, and political theory, he constructed arguments that were both philosophical and practical. In Federalist No. 9, he used the history of ancient Greek confederacies to argue for a stronger union. In No. 23, he drew on his military experience to explain the need for federal control of defense. In No. 78, he laid out a theory of judicial review that would later become foundational to American constitutional law. But the Federalist was more than a series of academic arguments. It was also a masterwork of political psychology. Hamilton understood that many Americans feared strong central government, so he carefully explained how the Constitution's system of checks and balances would prevent tyranny. When critics warned about the dangers of federal taxation, Hamilton responded with detailed explanations of how national credit and commerce would benefit ordinary citizens. The opposition was fierce. Cato, Brutus, and other anti-federalist writers filled the newspapers with warnings about the death of liberty under the new Constitution. At times, the debate turned personal. Hamilton was called a monarchist, an elitist, even a secret British agent. He responded not by attacking his critics, but by methodically dismantling their arguments. In Federalist Nota 84, Hamilton took on perhaps the strongest anti-Federalist argument, the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights. His response was characteristically bold. He argued that a Bill of Rights was not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. In a republic based on popular sovereignty, he contended, listing specific rights might imply that the people had only those rights explicitly enumerated. While writing the Federalist, Hamilton was also organizing the political campaign for ratification in New York. He recruited supporters, coordinated with Federalists in other states, and prepared for the state ratifying convention. Eliza rarely saw him during these months. When she did, he was usually at his desk, surrounded by books and papers, drafting yet another essay. The New York ratifying convention opened in Poughkeepsie in June 1788. Hamilton faced a daunting task. 2/3 of the delegates were initially opposed to the Constitution. For 6 weeks, he argued, debated, and negotiated. His knowledge of the Federalist Papers proved invaluable. He had essentially written a handbook for defending the Constitution and knew every argument inside and out. When news arrived that New Hampshire had become the 9th state to ratify, technically putting the Constitution into effect, Hamilton used it to increase pressure on New York. The state could either join the new union or risk isolation. His opponents gradually gave way, and on July 26, 1788, New York ratified the Constitution by a vote of 30-27. The victory was narrow but crucial. Without New York, the new nation would have been geographically divided and commercially crippled. Hamilton had won not through political deals or compromise, but through the sheer force of his arguments and his vision of America's future. The Federalist Papers, intended initially as political propaganda for New York's ratification debate, would become much more. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall would soon cite them in landmark decisions. Future generations would study them as the most authoritative explanation of the Constitution's meaning and purpose. They represented something rare in political literature, a work of immediate political impact that also achieved lasting philosophical significance. For Hamilton personally, the ratification struggle marked a transformation. He had entered it as New York's most brilliant lawyer. He emerged as one of the nation's leading political thinkers. His arguments in the Federalist Papers had done more than defend the Constitution. They had helped create a distinctly American political science. As Hamilton left the Poughkeepsie Convention, exhausted but triumphant, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The Constitution had established the framework for a stronger union, but someone would need to build the actual institutions of national power. Hamilton was already planning his next move. The Federalists' pen had helped create a new government. Now its author would have the chance to make that government work. Alexander Hamilton's Financial Revolution. On a September morning in 1789, Alexander Hamilton sat at a borrowed desk in a temporary office on Broadway, facing a task that would have daunted a lesser mind. As America's first Secretary of the Treasury, he had inherited an empty national purse, $54 million in war debts, worthless continental currency, 13 separate state financial systems, and no reliable source of government revenue. The new nation's credit was so poor that U.S. government bonds traded at 15 cents on the dollar in European markets. "The public debt is a public blessing," Hamilton wrote in his notebook that first day, a paradoxical statement that would soon become the foundation of his financial revolution. President Washington had given his former aide-de-camp a simple mandate: fix it. The simplicity of the order belied the complexity of the task. Hamilton wasn't just trying to balance books, he was attempting to create an entire financial system from scratch. He worked 18-hour days, his clerks struggling to keep pace as he produced report after report, each one a masterpiece of economic thinking. His first major proposal, the Report on Public Credit, landed on Congress's desk in January 1790. At 40,000 words, it was longer than a novel and more dramatic than most. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War and consolidate them into a single national debt. This debt would then be funded through new customs duties and excise taxes, with interest paid regularly to bondholders. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity. Hamilton wasn't just proposing to pay debts, he was trying to transform them into the foundation of a new financial system. Government bonds, regularly serviced, would become a form of currency, providing the capital that America's emerging economy desperately needed. The opposition was immediate and fierce. James Madison, Hamilton's former ally from the Federalist Papers, led the attack in Congress. Southern states, which had already paid off much of their war debt, saw no reason to help their northern neighbors. States' rights advocates warned about excessive federal power, and many Revolutionary War veterans who had sold their depreciated bonds at a fraction of their value were outraged to learn that speculators would profit from Hamilton's plan. But Hamilton had anticipated every objection. When Madison argued that it was unfair to reward speculators, Hamilton responded that maintaining the sanctity of contracts was essential for building national credit. When Southern states resisted, he orchestrated a compromise. The national capital would be moved south to a new city on the Potomac River in exchange for support for his financial plan. The report on public credit was just the beginning. In December 1790, Hamilton produced his report on a national bank, proposing an institution modeled partly on the Bank of England, but adapted for American conditions. The Bank of the United States would be a partnership between private investors and the government, capable of issuing paper money, handling government deposits, and providing the credit necessary for economic growth. The bank proposal sparked the new nation's first great constitutional debate. Madison and Jefferson argued that the Constitution gave Congress no explicit power to charter a bank. Hamilton's response, in his opinion on the constitutionality of the national bank, developed the doctrine of implied powers that would shape constitutional law for centuries to come. Necessary, Hamilton argued, didn't mean absolutely essential, but rather needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive to. A bank was necessary and proper for executing Congress's explicit powers over taxation, borrowing, and regulating commerce. Washington, after careful consideration, signed the Bank Bill. In 1791, Hamilton completed his triad of financial reports with the Report on Manufactures, a visionary document that went far beyond its nominal subject. While ostensibly about promoting manufacturing, it presented a comprehensive vision of American economic development. Hamilton argued for a diversified economy that would combine agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce. He proposed government support for innovation, infrastructure development, and what we would now call research and development. The Report on Manufactures was ahead of its time. Congress largely ignored it. But its vision of a dynamic, diversified economy would prove prophetic. Hamilton understood that America's future lay not in remaining an agricultural appendage to Europe, but in developing its own industrial and commercial power. Implementation of Hamilton's systems proved as challenging as their conception. In 1791, he introduced an excise tax on whiskey to help fund the national debt. The tax sparked resistance, culminating in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Hamilton accompanied President Washington to western Pennsylvania with a federal army, demonstrating that the new government could enforce its laws, another crucial precedent. By 1795, when Hamilton finally left the Treasury, he had accomplished what seemed impossible 6 years earlier. American government bonds traded above par in European markets. The Bank of the United States was operating successfully. A stable currency facilitated trade. Tax revenues flowed regularly into the Treasury. Most importantly, Hamilton had created a financial infrastructure that could support America's future growth. But the cost had been high. The battles over his programs had helped create America's first political parties. His former allies, Madison and Jefferson, had become bitter enemies. Rumors about corruption and speculation dogged him, though investigations never revealed any wrongdoing. The strain had affected his health and his family life. Alexander Hamilton and Partisan Warfare, 1795 to 1800. The public confession appeared in all major newspapers in August 1797. "My real crime," Alexander Hamilton wrote, "is an amorous connection with James Reynolds's wife." It was perhaps the first sex scandal in American political history, and Hamilton's 95-page pamphlet addressing it, titled Observations on Certain Documents, but soon known simply as the Reynolds Pamphlet, was unlike anything the young nation had seen. The former Treasury Secretary was responding to accusations of financial corruption during his time in office. His solution: admit to adultery to prove his public accounts were clean. "The charge against me," he explained with characteristic logical precision, "is a connection with Reynolds for purposes of improper pecuniary speculation. My real crime is an amorous connection with his wife, for a considerable time with his privity and connivance." It was vintage Hamilton, meticulous, exhaustive, and spectacularly self-destructive. The years following Hamilton's departure from the Treasury in 1795 marked a period of intense partisan warfare that would test not only his political skills, but his very conception of how American democracy should function. The nation was splitting into two increasingly hostile political parties: the Federalists, who broadly supported Hamilton's vision of a strong central government and commercial development, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who advocated for a more limited federal role and an agrarian society. These divisions were exacerbated by international events. The French Revolution, which had begun as a celebration of liberty, had descended into the Reign of Terror. When France declared war on Britain in 1793, the new American nation faced a crucial choice. Jefferson's Republicans sympathized with the French revolutionary cause. Hamilton and the Federalists preferred closer ties with Britain, seeing stable commercial relations as crucial for American prosperity. The debate reached a crisis point with Jay's Treaty in 1795. John Jay had negotiated an agreement with Britain that avoided war but made significant concessions. Hamilton, though privately disappointed with many aspects of the treaty, launched into a vigorous public defense. Writing under the pseudonym Camillus, he produced 38 essays arguing that the treaty, while imperfect, was vital for maintaining peace and commerce. "The choice," he wrote, "is not between this treaty and a better one, but between this treaty and war." His arguments helped secure ratification, but at a cost. The treaty debate further poisoned relations with Jefferson's Republicans and sparked violent protests in New York, where Hamilton was pelted with stones while defending the treaty to an angry crowd. The partisan divide deepened during the quasi-war with France in 1798 to 1800. When French privateers began seizing American merchant ships, Hamilton called for military preparedness. President Adams reluctantly appointed him as a major general, second in command of the new army. Hamilton threw himself into military planning with characteristic energy, but his relationship with Adams was fraught with tension and mutual distrust. The crisis prompted the Federalist-controlled Congress to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, restricting press criticism of the government and making it easier to deport foreigners. Hamilton, despite his Federalist leadership, was uncomfortable with these restrictions on civil liberties. He wrote privately to Federalist leaders, urging restraint, arguing that such measures would ultimately harm their cause. His predictions proved correct. The Alien and Sedition Acts sparked a backlash that strengthened Jefferson's Republicans. Meanwhile, President Adams, without consulting Hamilton or other Federalist leaders, opened secret peace negotiations with France. The move split the Federalist Party, with Hamilton and his allies feeling betrayed. The Reynolds affair emerged amid these political battles. Hamilton's enemies had discovered his affair with Maria Reynolds and his payments to her husband, James Reynolds, who had essentially blackmailed Hamilton. Rather than allow his opponents to twist the scandal into accusations of financial corruption, Hamilton chose to publish the entire sordid story. The personal cost was enormous. Eliza, who was pregnant with their 6th child, left New York for her father's home in Albany. Hamilton's political enemies gleefully circulated the pamphlet. His friends were aghast at his public self-immolation. Even his mentor, George Washington, maintained a disapproving silence. Yet, in a characteristic twist, Hamilton's excessive candor actually helped validate his public accounts. No one who read his painfully detailed confession could doubt his financial integrity. But the episode highlighted a fundamental tension in Hamilton's character. His commitment to defending his honor often overwhelmed his political judgment. The presidential election of 1800 brought these conflicts to a head. When it became clear that President Adams would seek re-election, Hamilton wrote a scathing critique of his former ally's character and presidency. The document, intended for private circulation among Federalist leaders, was leaked to the press by Aaron Burr, Hamilton's longtime New York rival. The result was catastrophic for the Federalists. The party split between Adams and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, while Jefferson's Republicans remained united. When the Electoral College deadlocked between Jefferson and Burr, Hamilton faced a final choice. Despite his deep ideological differences with Jefferson, Hamilton used his influence to break the deadlock in Jefferson's favor, considering him a less dangerous choice than the unprincipled Burr. "If there be a man in the world I ought to hate," Hamilton wrote to a friend, "it is Jefferson, but the public good must be paramount to every private consideration." As the century turned, Hamilton found himself increasingly isolated politically. The Federalist Party he had helped build was fracturing. His dream of a strong central government guiding national development seemed to be giving way to Jefferson's vision of limited federal power and states' rights. Yet Hamilton refused to abandon his principles. In a series of essays signed Lucius Crassus, he warned about the dangers of Jeffersonian democracy, arguing that stable government required balancing popular will with protecting property rights and maintaining social order. The partisan warfare of the 1790s had transformed American politics, creating a two-party system that neither the founders nor the Constitution had anticipated. It had also transformed Hamilton, turning the brilliant young Treasury Secretary into a more complex and controversial figure. Still brilliant, still patriotic, but increasingly out of step with the democratic tide he had helped unleash. As the new century began, Hamilton turned his attention back to his law practice and his growing family. But the political battles weren't over. His most personal and fatal conflict still lay ahead. Honor's Price, the legacy of Alexander Hamilton. On a cold November morning in 1801, Alexander Hamilton stood in a downtown Manhattan courtroom defending a young journalist accused of sedition. The case seemed routine, but Hamilton's closing argument transcended the immediate legal issues. For 3 hours, he spoke without notes about the essential role of press freedom in a republic. The courtroom fell silent as he connected this obscure case to the larger principles he had spent his life defending. The liberty of the press, he declared, is the right to publish truth under the guidance of virtue. It is the palladium of all civil, political, and religious rights. The jury acquitted his client, but Hamilton's mind was elsewhere. His eldest son, Philip, 19 years old and recently graduated from Columbia, had become embroiled in a political dispute that was heading toward a duel. The parallels to Hamilton's own life were haunting. Like his father, Philip was brilliant, quick-tempered, and hypersensitive about matters of honor. The dispute had begun at a theater, where George Eaker, a Democratic-Republican lawyer, had given a speech criticizing Alexander Hamilton. Philip, defending his father's honor, had confronted Eaker. Words escalated to challenges, and now father and son were discussing the protocols of dueling. Hamilton, who had served as second in several duels but never as principal, gave his son careful advice about the code duello. "Present your body full front," he counseled, knowing this would make Philip a smaller target. The duel was set for November 23, 1801, at Weehawken, New Jersey, the same ground where Hamilton himself would meet Aaron Burr 3 years later. Philip followed his father's instructions precisely, except for one crucial detail. Rather than delaying his shot as advised, he fired immediately and missed. Eaker's return shot struck Philip in the hip. Alexander Hamilton spent the next 36 hours at his son's bedside, watching helplessly as infection spread. Philip died on November 24th, in the same house where he had been born. The loss shattered the Hamilton family. Angelica, Hamilton's eldest daughter and Philip's closest sibling, suffered a mental breakdown from which she never fully recovered. Eliza was inconsolable. Hamilton threw himself into work with even greater intensity than before, as if trying to outrun his grief. The personal tragedy coincided with political defeat. Jefferson's presidency marked the triumph of Hamilton's opponents and the eclipse of his Federalist vision. The new administration began dismantling Hamilton's financial system, closing the Bank of the United States and reducing the federal government's economic role. Yet Hamilton refused to retire from public life. He continued his law practice, often taking cases pro bono when they involved constitutional principles. He founded the New York Evening Post, using it to critique Jefferson's policies. He established an orphanage and a school for Native American children. Most significantly, he began working on a detailed plan for a military academy, his last great contribution to American institutional development. The final crisis began in 1804, when Aaron Burr, having fallen from Jefferson's favor, ran for governor of New York. Hamilton, who had long considered Burr a dangerous opportunist, worked tirelessly to defeat him, both in public speeches and private correspondence. After Burr lost the election, he focused his fury on Hamilton, demanding satisfaction for alleged defamation. The specific cause was a letter in which Hamilton had expressed a despicable opinion of Burr. The language was mild by the standards of the day, but Burr, his political career in ruins, seized on it as pretext for a duel. Hamilton, still haunted by Philip's death and deeply conscious of his family's needs, tried to avoid the confrontation. He wrote a carefully worded response that defended his right to express political opinions while attempting to diffuse Burr's anger. But Burr would not be appeased. As the exchange of letters continued through June 1804, Hamilton confided to friends that he believed Burr was determined to force a duel. He began putting his affairs in order, writing a farewell letter to Eliza and preparing detailed instructions about his debts and assets. On July 11, 1804, Hamilton rose before dawn and crossed the Hudson to Weehawken. He had told several friends that he intended to waste his shot, a decision that reflected both his moral opposition to dueling and his sense of guilt over Philip's death. Whether he actually intended to do so remains one of history's great unknowns. The duel itself was brief. At 10 paces, Burr's bullet struck Hamilton in the right side, shattering his ribs and lodging in his spine. Hamilton's pistol discharged, but whether before or after he was hit remains disputed. He fell immediately, saying, "I am a dead man." Hamilton survived for 31 hours, long enough to receive communion from Episcopal Bishop Benjamin Moore and to repeatedly express concern for Eliza's welfare. He died on the afternoon of July 12, 1804, at a friend's house in Greenwich Village. He was 47 years old. The public reaction was explosive. Burr, charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, fled south. Hamilton's funeral procession was the largest New York had ever seen, with even his political enemies acknowledging the magnitude of the loss. Gouverneur Morris delivered a eulogy that captured both Hamilton's greatness and his complexity. He was capable of all things, but chose to do only those which were great and good. Hamilton's death marked the end of an era in American politics. The Federalist Party never recovered from the loss of its most brilliant advocate. Jefferson's vision of America would dominate the next 2 decades, yet Hamilton's legacy proved more durable than his political movement. The financial system he created, though modified, remained the foundation of American economic power. His constitutional interpretations shaped the development of American law. His vision of a dynamic, commercially oriented nation gradually became reality. Eliza Hamilton survived her husband by 50 years, dying in 1854 at age 97. She spent those decades collecting his papers, defending his reputation, and continuing his philanthropic work. She founded New York's first private orphanage, the Hamilton Free School, and helped raise funds for the Washington Monument. Her last major project was ensuring that her husband's voluminous writings would be preserved for posterity. Hamilton's story ended at Weehawken, but his influence on American life was just beginning. The immigrant orphan who had fought his way to the pinnacle of American power left behind more than memories. He left institutions that would help transform 13 fractious states into a global superpower, ideas that would shape American jurisprudence for centuries, and warnings about the dangers of political extremism that remain relevant today. In death, as in life, Alexander Hamilton forced America to wrestle with fundamental questions about power, money, and democracy. The duel with Burr may have been about personal honor, but it also symbolized the larger conflicts that Hamilton had spent his life engaging, between principle and pragmatism, between personal glory and public service, between competing visions of America's future. Honor's price had been high, but Hamilton's legacy proved priceless.